And we are now joined by Heather MacDonald, the author of The War on Cops. She's a Manhattan Institute scholar. Heather, thanks for joining me this afternoon. And there we go. Yeah, there it is. Heather, hi. Thanks for joining me.
Hi. Thank you.
Heather, could you? I've introduced you, and I've mentioned your book. I'd like you to just, in a nutshell, tell my audience exactly what happened when you went to speak at Claremont McKenna University.
Okay. Are we on air right now?
Yes, we are.
Oh, thank you. Okay.
You're welcome.
Well, basically, the building where I was supposed to speak was blockaded by about 250 to 300 protesters chanting, drumming, pounding on the glass walls to prevent any fellow students from entering the building or to prevent faculty. I was escorted into the building via a secret passageway out of the reach of the protesters. There had been planned a series of meetings with students and a dinner beforehand, and there were supposed to be well over 100 people attending. In fact, the hall was completely empty. I gave my speech to a camera. It was live streamed. During the speech, the few people that were in the room, mostly police officers, were riveted by what was happening outside, people pounding on the glass. I was able to take two questions that had been forwarded in by people watching on live stream. But after that, the police decided that the situation outside was getting too dangerous, and so the interaction with the questioners from afar was peremptorily ended, and I was hustled out the building into, again, through a secret passageway, this time through the kitchen, into a waiting police van, and sped away to the Claremont Police Department. The police had set up some barriers around the building beforehand to try and prevent a blockade, but they did absolutely nothing to prevent the students from overturning their security barriers and taking control of the building.
Heather, I've heard that the people that are involved in these kinds of ugly, violent protests are not students, that they come from the outside. They're what we used to call back in the 60s outside agitators. What have you observed with regard to who is doing this?
Well, I observed nothing because I was
right.
put in a safe house initially, and I saw this. I heard the chanting for the 2 hours before. I saw some students walk by. I saw a petite blonde with her face covered by a Palestinian headscarf and a battery pack on her back for amplifying her bullhorn. But the videos that I've seen, these were clearly students. This was not the Black Bloc anarchists. There were some people who were masked, but this had been a call on a person of color page for the students at the 5 related Claremont colleges to shut me down, and I think this was purely a student effort.
It's a reflection of what's happening on campus. I mean, I'm right now broadcasting here at Tufts University in Medford, Mass., and I've already been put on notice that I'm being investigated by the anti-bias police. And the college paper's done an article about me where they throw some pretty hard rocks at me, at least literally. And, the atmosphere is one of fear. Students are afraid to speak to me. They won't call in. And I don't blame them. They have their parents are spending $50,000 a year. They don't want to get investigated. They don't want someone call this anti-bias group, and they could end up losing everything. I mean, it's an atmosphere of, for lack of a better word, it's fascism.
Well, I don't know how one avoids the word, and I'm reluctant to engage in the same type of ridiculous hyperbole that the left engages in, such as calling me an anti-supremacist, a white supremacist, fascist, racist. Yet, when you have people that are, in some cases, using violence, as we saw in the Milo protests in Berkeley, feeling entitled to sucker punch their perceived opponents, and deciding on their own force who gets to hear what and what is appropriate to be in the public arena, I just don't know how you not call that fascism or a soft totalitarianism. It's absolutely astounding, and my hat always goes out now to these intrepid college Republican clubs that are willing to bucket, because, as you say, you never know how much power is going to be wielded against dissenting opinion. The real problem here, obviously, is the administrators and the faculty that are allowing such ignorance to be common and accepted among students. I mean, the ridiculous potted theory that they throw out, claiming that at Pomona, for instance, there was a letter that went out by, again, these students of color to the Pomona president, complaining about his wan defense of free speech after the blockade of my speech. And they have these ridiculously shallow claims that, well, the Enlightenment was what gave rise to imperialism, colonialism, racism, homophobia, misogyny, you name it. None of these students have read Voltaire or Diderot or any of the Enlightenment thinkers or Hume, Kant. It's absurd. They know nothing, and yet they're allowed to get away with these embarrassing efforts at showing off their high theory that has a consequence that really should not be tolerated on an American university.
Well, they've completely and utterly embraced cultural, if not literal, Marxism and the Marxist theory of exploitation, or conspiracy theory of exploitation, in the literal sense. I mean, it's the facts of the matter are really not relevant. It's communist facts if they fit into a view. But you point out, and I think quite rightly, that the problem is also, or probably is mainly, the administration. I mean, these people have always been around. They've always been on campus, but what gives them the kind of ability now to do something like censor you and have to go through a horrendous experience that no American intellectual should ever have to face, that's only because of an administration that permits it. They didn't have to permit it. They did permit it. This happened because of them.
Well, I hope that this issue, and it finally wakes up the American public to what is happening to universities. They seem to care about the public, about the free speech issue, but there's something even deeper that underlies this, which is the colonization of the university by identity politics and victim ideology. I don't know about if it's Marxist, but it's something sort of even more narcissistic, I think, which is the worldview that, to be a college student today on campus, if you're a member of one of these privileged victim groups, ever growing in number, you're oppressed. I mean, this is absurd. There's no more privileged position in history than to be an American college student, and yet the administration encourages the identity politics, encourages the victimology, and they have whole bureaucracies set up, the diversity bureaucracies, to fuel this student delusion. And so there's a codependency between these students and the bureaucrats.
I think that this identity politics, when you get down to it, it's really no different than the very white supremacy that they complain about. which is also identity politics. It's this belief that people are defined by such issues as race, however that's defined, or ethnic background, or sex, or sexual orientation, and that these things become who someone is. I think that if you take a look at the way, like, women's studies are taught in some colleges, black studies, they actually teach the students that that women or black people or people of different ethnic backgrounds, that they are literally different. It's classic racism, actually. It's no different than white supremacy. And then there's, of course, the us versus them, the oppression element that gives it fuel. That's the engine that makes the thing run.
Right. I mean, and it's not just a few colleges where that's taught. It's virtually every college now. I mean, there's not a single moment in the humanities practically that is not taken over by this. And it's not just they're being taught that they're different, but that they're oppressed. They're taught to see themselves as victims, and so they go around for the rest of their lives with chips on their shoulder, unable to take advantage of the opportunities that are there.
Heather, I want to thank you for sharing the situation that happened to you, because this is just, I think, the beginning of what we're going to be seeing as more conservatives are driven off of the public stage. Can you tell me briefly, because I know we only have a minute or so, about your book, The War on Cops?
Well, I take on the Black Lives Matter narrative that holds that policing is systemically racist and that we're living through an epidemic of racially biased police shootings of black males. And I show that those claims are false. A greater percentage of white and Hispanic homicide victims are killed by a cop than black homicide victims. 12% of all whites and Hispanics who die of homicide are killed by a police officer, compared to 4% of black homicide victims who are killed by a police officer. Mm-hmm. And policing is actually the government agency most dedicated to the proposition that Black Lives Matter. Proactive policing has saved tens of thousands of minority lives over the last 2 decades, but that triumph over crime is now at risk thanks to the Black Lives Matter rhetorical assault on the police that has also resulted in last year a 50% increase in gun murders of officers, because officers are backing off of proactive policing in high-crime minority neighborhoods, and we're seeing in many cities a almost unprecedented surge in homicides and shootings and other violent crime.
Well, that's, of course, the other side of the coin with Black Lives Matter, which is that it's a fairly open war against police, and the result is that police have left the field of battle. They don't want to be at war. They risk their lives every day going out and trying to actually help the 99.9% of people in minority neighborhoods get on with their lives and protect them from these thugs. So the result is you have cities now like Baltimore, where the mayor, after having completely thrown the police under the bus last year, they're now asking the federal government to come in with, I guess, military assistance because it's gotten so bad.
Well, yeah, and they're also, I have a piece out currently in the National Review. The most bizarre thing is Jeff Sessions offered to say, I'm not going to put you under a federal consent decree. If you want to reform your department, be my guest. You can do it on your own. I trust you to run your department constitutionally. And the mayor and the police chief just had a fit and said, oh, no, please do not give us autonomy. We want to be under a tens of millions, hundreds of millions of dollars federal monitor, overpriced federal monitor, filling out reports all the time. So,
right.
Baltimore now has its highest per capita homicide rate in its history. Chicago, there were 4,300 people shot last year, one person every 2 hours. If you believe Black Lives Matter, you'd think the cops were shooting a lot of people because the victims are practically all black. In fact, the Chicago cops shot 25 people, 0.6% of the total, virtually all of them armed and dangerous.
Yeah, it's a sad situation. Heather MacDonald, can let my listeners know where they could get information about you and your books and articles.
Well, the book is on Amazon, The War on Cops, and it's certainly at bookstores. And I guess the best way is the Manhattan Institute website, which is manhattan-institute.org for getting, I think they have a pretty complete list of my articles there.
All right, Heather, I want to thank you for joining me this afternoon. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Chuck.
All right, take care. Okay, that's Heather MacDonald. She's the author of The War on Cops, Manhattan Institute fellow. Check it out. You know, this is an important scholar, someone who offers a voice that's alternative to the left, but it's a responsible voice. It's a voice that ought to be heard in an institution that honors the idea of a free and open exchange of ideas. Something that, unfortunately, many of our American institutions of higher learning are shrinking away from, which is why I bring her on the show. Anyway, you're welcome to join me, Chuck Morse, in the final segment here. 855-915-9636. 855-915-9636. Getting back to my article that will be appearing next week in Newsmax, and that is about the cause of why the BDS is the boycott Israel movement. Why that's a left-wing thing? What is the appeal to the left? Why do left-wingers want to attack a society that is one of them, certainly by no means utopian, of course, but is a very progressive society. Let me just read a little bit from my article. The sales pitch is the same two-pronged appeal that the enemies of Israel make to the international left in general, that sales pitch being to students. And that is an attack on Israel as a capitalist state and as a Jewish state. More broadly, the attack against Israel is a vanguard attack against capitalism and religion. The left views capitalism, private ownership of production, private ownership of property, and religion, belief in a God that creates laws that transcend human manipulation, as the main obstacle standing in the way of their materialistic understanding of what constitutes societal progress. Karl Marx called for the annihilation of Judaism in his infamous pamphlet, quote, On the Jewish Question. First published in 1846, the screed would be later republished under the title A World Without Jews, and would become canon for the left until World War II made such blatant anti-Semitism unfashionable. Marx wrote that Judaism was responsible for introducing such forms of, quote, false consciousness as, quote, self-interest, huckstering, and money, unquote. And that these false or invented ideas were devised as part of a sinister conspiracy on the part of the bourgeoisie to, quote, exploit workers. Marx used these terms as code words for private property and free trade. If Judaism were made impossible, to use Marx's term, then Marx reasoned that these forms of, quote, false consciousness would wither away, along with the family, sovereignty, and individual identity itself. This would lead, according to Marxist understanding, to the final stage of societal progress, where all humanity would become de facto equal and all material would become automatically collectivized. Marx called this final stage of progress communism, and he viewed religion as the opiate of the masses, as part of the conspiracy of the bourgeoisie to exploit the masses with false, hypnotic ideas. Thus, the left seeks to destroy Israel for the same reason that Marx sought to destroy Judaism Indeed, the left seeks to undermine Israel for the same reasons that they seek to undermine America and Christianity. Since outright war is too risky, at least at this time, and since the forces of freedom are too strong, they seek to enact their agenda gradually through subterfuge and subversion. They take a long view and are willing to wait centuries to enact their unnatural agenda. Israel's Arab and Islamic enemies fear a democratic Israel, one that respects property rights and the rights of the individual, as such a society threatens their authoritarian oligarchies. They are afraid that their own people might look at how genuinely progressive Israel is and respond by waking up and demanding control over their own lives and societies. These enemies have much in common with the international left, their natural allies, and they know how to manipulate leftists, particularly young college students who attend such privileged institutions as Tufts University. Generally, people who come from hard backgrounds, those young people who work or who are of faith, are less susceptible to the leftist siren song. Okay, so that's my article. It's going to be published probably, my articles are usually published on Tuesdays at newsmax.com. You're welcome to read it in the opinion page there. And again, I want to thank Brian Maloney for joining me earlier. Brian is the editor of Media Equalizer, and he's launching this new group called Stop the Scalpings. Check it out. It's online. And Heather MacDonald from the Manhattan Institute. Her book is The War on Cops. And she just had a harrowing experience speaking about these issues at the Claremont McKenna College. I suppose that the propaganda put forth is that she's got something against black men and women because she's criticizing the influence that Black Lives Matter has had on our politics. And, we have, of course, a situation where, again, reasonable people cannot. It's not that they can't. It's that it's like, I think that this was the thesis against me in the Tufts Observer article, where they threw out the accusation that I'm racist without qualifying it in the article at all. But as I look at the archives of this program, and by the way, the program is podcasted at iTunes and Stitcher and a bunch of other places, Google Play. I've listened to the fact that my only real discussion about race has been a critique of how left-wing policies and left-wing ideas have been damaging, and I would suggest, to the African American community going all the way back to the 1960s, and how they basically snatched away from a large segment of the black community the opportunity to become more successful and more integrated into our economy and our society. I'm not suggesting that racism itself is going to go away. It's not. That's an unfortunate and dark side of human nature. But what I'm suggesting is that it's almost putting aside racism. The way the policies of the left toward the black community damaged that community, and as such, it exacerbated racism. It kept racism as a real social problem, one that hurts people or prevents people from getting ahead. Right? I mean, like, I know in this country that we have anti-Semitism. I don't doubt that for a second. But I'm speaking here as a Jew. Anti-Semitism is not going to prevent me from conducting my life as I see fit, from getting ahead. It's not a factor in my life. So, my analysis is that the left's policies actually perpetrated racism in the literal sense, in that they created problems for the black community. They hurt black people. And as a result, they exacerbated racial conflict. Once in a while, I suppose, anti-Semitism rears its head in the form of boycotting Israel, which is anti-Semitic. And I speak out against that. Another left-wing attempt to compromise Judaism and Israel, and as such create conflict or dialectic between groups. But the main topic is that because of this sort of analysis, someone hearing this on campus, and I think there was a particular student here who heard this, and his name is mentioned in the article. I'm not going to mention it here, but you can read it at Tufts Observer. The article is called Morse Code. He heard these comments, and in his context, the context in which he lives, and which he's probably been conditioned, he thinks that means I got something against black people, that I'm racist. And that to me is, well, I mean, it just shows how far and how successful left-wing propaganda has become. I would suggest that Donald Trump has, in his own often awkward manner and inarticulate syntax, he has put to the test this kind of political correctness, because he didn't cower in the face of it. This is a kind of an informal tyranny. It's a soft totalitarianism, not so soft in the case of what Heather MacDonald just had to deal with at Claremont McKenna, but soft in that we're afraid that if we have any kind of a public dialogue on social issues pertaining to race, ethnicity, gender, or women or sex as it's more accurately described, or sexuality, that we can likewise be attacked. He put that to the test. He stood up to it, and it didn't really stick to him.